The wind didn't just blow through the city. It screamed. It was the kind of Christmas Eve where the cold felt personal, like it was searching for the gaps in your coat just to remind you of how little you had. Elias stood at the corner of 4th and Oak, his hands shoved so deep into his pockets his knuckles hurt. He wasn't looking at the festive lights or the families rushing toward warmth with bags of gifts. He was looking at the ground. Elias was 34, but tonight his reflection in the shop windows looked 50. His life had become a series of almost moments that ended in not enough. He had almost saved his small repair business. He had almost kept up with the rent. But as of 3 hours ago, a bright orange sticker on his apartment door told him that almost had finally run out. He had exactly 72 hours before the locks were changed. He began the walk back to his place, taking the shortcut through the park. Usually the park was a place of peace, but tonight the shadows felt heavy. That's when he saw him. Sitting on a bench that was half covered in a drift of dry, powdery snow was an old man. He wasn't wearing a heavy parka or a thermal hat. He wore a thin, charcoal-colored wool coat that might have been elegant 30 years ago, but was now frayed at the cuffs. He sat perfectly still, his chin tucked into a scarf, clutching a small, battered leather notebook to his chest, like it was the only thing keeping him tethered to the earth. Elias stopped. His first instinct, the instinct sharpened by months of hardship, was to keep walking. I can't even help myself, he thought. How am I supposed to help someone else? He walked 10 paces past the bench. Then he stopped again. The image of the man's frozen, pale hands wouldn't leave his mind. Elias turned around, the snow crunching loudly under his boots. Elias called out. His voice felt rusty. Sir, it's below freezing. You can't stay here. The old man didn't move at first. Then, slowly, he lifted his head. His eyes were a startling, clear blue, but they looked through Elias rather than at him. He looked like a man who had been waiting for a bus that was decades late. I seem to have lost my way, the old man said. His voice was surprisingly steady, though it had a rhythmic, melodic quality to it. The landmarks, they've changed. There used to be a clockmaker on the corner, a man named Silas. Elias felt a pang of pity. Silas, the clockmaker, had been gone for 20 years. There's no clockmaker anymore, sir. It's a coffee chain now. Everything is different. The old man looked down at his leather notebook and nodded slowly. Time is a thief, isn't it? It steals the places we love while we aren't looking. Elias looked at the man's thin coat and then at his own shaking hands. He knew he had $5 in his pocket and a half-empty can of soup in his cupboard. He knew that taking a stranger home was a risk, and honestly, his home wasn't much of a sanctuary. But the thought of leaving this man to become a statistic in the morning news made him feel sick. Look, Elias said, stepping closer. I'm Elias. I don't have much actually. I have almost nothing, but I have a heater that still works for now. You can't stay out here. You'll freeze. The old man looked at Elias, then really looked at him. It felt like those blue eyes were reading the orange eviction notice still burning in Elias's pocket. He didn't ask if Elias was a good man. He didn't ask where they were going. He simply stood up, his joints popping like dry twigs, and tucked the notebook under his arm. My name is Arthur, he said softly, and I think, Elias, that we are both exactly where we are supposed to be. As they walked back toward the crumbling apartment building, Elias found himself wondering why he felt more nervous than the man he was rescuing. He led Arthur up the 3 flights of stairs, the hallway smelling of stale cooking oil and damp carpet. When they reached door 3B, Elias tried to shield the orange sticker with his body as he fumbled with the keys. They stepped inside. The apartment was small, one main room that served as a kitchen and living area, with a mattress in the corner. Tools were scattered on a workbench, remnants of Elias's failed dreams of being a furniture. Restaurateur didn't complain about the small space or the dim lighting. He walked straight to the window and looked out at the city. Elias hurried to the stove, his heart hammering against his ribs. He felt a strange urge to make the place look better than it was, to hide the poverty that was closing in on him. I have some soup, Elias said, his back to the old man. It's just tomato. Nothing fancy. Tomato is the color of warmth, Arthur replied, still looking out the window. It will do perfectly. Elias poured the soup into two mismatched mugs. As he handed one to Arthur, he noticed the old man looking at the workbench. Arthur's eyes lingered on a hand planer and a set of chisels that Elias hadn't had the heart to sell yet. "You work with your hands," Arthur noted, taking a slow sip of the soup. "I used to," Elias said, sitting on the edge of his mattress. "Now I just try to get by. Most people want cheap plastic stuff these days. They don't want things that last." Arthur sat in the only armchair in the room, a sagging velvet thing Elias had found on a curb 2 years ago. He set his mug down and opened the leather notebook. Instead of writing, he began to draw. His hand moved with a precision that didn't match his frail appearance. "People always want things that last, Elias," Arthur said without looking up. "They just forget that they want them until they see them. They lose their way, just like I did in the park." For the next hour, the room was silent except for the whistling of the wind against the glass and the scratching of Arthur's pen. Elias watched him, feeling a strange sense of calm. For the first time in months, he wasn't thinking about the bank, the landlord, or the empty bank account. He was just a man, sharing a meal with another man. On a night when the world was supposed to be kind, but as the clock ticked toward midnight, Elias noticed something odd. Arthur wasn't just sketching shapes. He was drawing the apartment, but not as it was. He was drawing it filled with beautiful hand-carved wood. He was drawing the life Elias had once dreamed of. "Should get some sleep," Elias whispered, feeling the weight of the day finally crashing down on him. "You can take the bed. I'll take the chair." Arthur shook his head. "The chair is fine for an old man. My mind is busy tonight." "You sleep, Elias. You have a long journey ahead of you tomorrow." Elias didn't argue. He was too tired to wonder what the old man meant. He lay down on the mattress, pulling a thin blanket over his shoulders. As he drifted off, the last thing he saw was Arthur's silhouette against the window, the pen still moving across the paper, a silent witness to a man who had lost everything except his humanity. He had no idea that by the time the sun rose, the notebook on that table would contain the blueprint for his entire future. The first light of Christmas morning wasn't gold or bright. It was a pale, dusty gray that filtered through the frost on the window pane. Elias woke up with a start, his muscles aching from sleeping in a cramped position on the floor mattress. For a few seconds, he forgot about the old man. He forgot about the orange sticker on the door. He just lay there, listening to the radiator clank and hiss, a sound that usually filled him with dread because it reminded him of the utility bills he couldn't pay. Then he remembered Arthur. He sat up quickly, expecting to see the old man still perched in the velvet chair. But the chair was empty. The small space felt different, quieter, yet heavier. The scent of the tomato soup from the night before had faded, replaced by a faint, crisp smell of cedar and old paper. "Arthur?" Elias called out, his voice cracking. There was no answer. He stood up, his heart beginning to race. A cold draft was coming from the hallway. He looked toward the entrance and saw that the heavy wooden door was pushed slightly open, just a crack. The deadbolt hadn't been turned. Panic flared in his chest. Had the old man wandered back out into the freezing morning? He hadn't even had a proper coat. Elias rushed to the door and looked out into the hallway. It was empty. The stairs were silent. He stepped back inside, leaning his head against the doorframe. He felt a wave of guilt wash over him. He had tried to do something good. And now, a confused elderly man was lost in the city on Christmas Day because Elias had fallen asleep. He turned back to the room, ready to grab his boots and go searching when his eyes landed on the coffee table there. Sitting exactly where Arthur had been sitting was the leather notebook. Beside it sat the empty soup mug, washed clean and turned upside down on a small napkin. Arthur hadn't just left. He had cleaned up after himself, and he had left his most prized possession behind. Elias walked over to the table slowly, as if the notebook were a living thing. He picked it up. The leather was soft, worn down by years of being held. It felt warm, or maybe that was just his imagination. He hesitated, feeling like he was intruding on a person's soul. But the need to find a clue and address, a phone number, A name overcame his hesitation. He opened the first page. There was no name or address. Instead, there was a drawing of a hand holding a chisel. It was so detailed that Elias could see the calluses on the fingers and the grain of the wood being carved. Below it, in that same elegant script he'd seen the night before, were the words, "The wood remembers the tree, but the chair remembers the man." Elias flipped through the pages, his breath catching in his throat. This wasn't just a diary. It was a masterclass. Page after page was filled with blueprints for furniture that Elias had only seen in high-end design magazines, intricate joint work, secret compartments, and finishes that seemed to glow even on the paper. But as he got to the middle of the book, the content changed. The drawing stopped being about furniture and started being about people. There was a sketch of a woman laughing in a bakery, a sketch of a young boy playing with a wooden hoop, and then his heart stopped. He reached a page that was still fresh, the ink barely dry. It was a sketch of him. Elias didn't a drawing. Elias didn't look like a man on the verge of eviction. He didn't look tired or broken. Arthur had drawn him standing at a workbench, the sun hitting his face, holding a piece of finished oak with a look of pure, quiet pride. Underneath the drawing, Arthur had written a list of 3 phone numbers and a short note. Elias, you looked at my hands last night and saw an old man who was cold. I looked at your hands and saw a craftsman who was lost. The world is full of people who need things to be fixed. Start with these. Elias sat down in the velvet chair, the notebook heavy in his lap. He felt a lump forming in his throat. Who was this man? He wasn't just a wanderer. Nobody draws like that by accident. He looked at the first phone number. It had a local area code. He glanced at his phone. The screen was cracked, and he was 2 days away from the service being cut off. He took a deep breath and dialed. The phone rang 3 times before a man answered. His voice sounded thick, like he had been crying or hadn't slept. "Hello?" The man said, "My name is Elias. I'm calling because I met an older gentleman last night named Arthur. He left a notebook with me, and your number was in it." There was a long, sharp silence on the other end of the line. Elias heard the sound of a chair scraping against a floor. "You found him?" the man whispered. "Is he okay? Where is he?" "He stayed at my place last night," Elias explained, trying to sound as calm as possible. He seemed a bit confused, but he was safe. "I woke up this morning and he was gone, but he left this book. Listen to me, Elias." The man's voice was urgent now. "My name is Silas. Arthur is my father. He's been missing since yesterday afternoon. We've had the police out all night. We thought, with the cold, we thought we'd lost him." Elias felt a chill go down his spine. "He's not with you?" "No," Silas said, "but if he left you that book, it means something. My father doesn't let anyone touch that book, not even me." "Where are you?" "I'm coming to get you. We need to find him, and if he left that with you, you're the only lead we have." As Elias gave the man his address, he looked back at the sketch of himself in the notebook. He looked at the tools on his workbench, covered in dust and disappointment. He realized that for the first time in a year, he wasn't thinking about how to survive the next hour. He was part of something bigger. He realized that Arthur hadn't been the one who was lost in the park. Arthur knew exactly where he was going. It was Elias who had been found. He grabbed his coat, tucked the notebook inside his chest pocket right over his heart, and headed for the door. He didn't even look at the orange sticker as he walked out. For the first time, the cold didn't feel like it was screaming at him. It felt like a challenge. He stood on the sidewalk, waiting for Silas to arrive, watching the snow fall on the empty street. He kept his hand on the notebook, feeling the weight of it. He began to think about the names Arthur had mentioned, the clockmaker, the people who remember. He didn't know it yet. But the man he had given a bowl of soup to was about to hand him the keys to a kingdom he didn't even know existed. But first, he had to find Arthur. He had to make sure the man who had seen his soul was safe. The car that pulled up to the curb wasn't the kind of car Elias usually saw in his neighborhood. It was a dark, polished SUV that looked like it belonged in a movie. The man who stepped out looked tired, his eyes red from a night of searching, but he moved with a sense of purpose. This was Silas, Arthur's son. When he saw Elias standing there in his thin jacket, clutching the leather notebook, his expression shifted from panic to a strange kind of relief. They didn't talk much at first. The air was too cold for small talk. Silas just nodded and motioned for Elias to get inside. As they drove away from the crumbling apartment building, Elias felt like he was leaving a version of himself behind. He kept his hand on the notebook in his lap. He felt like he was holding someone's life in his hands. He talks about the people who remember, Elias said, breaking the silence. That's what he wrote in the book. He said I should call them. Silas sighed, a long, heavy sound. My father was the best at what he did. For 50 years, if you had a piece of history, a table from the 1800s, a chair that had been in a family for 4 generations, you took it to him. He didn't just fix wood. He restored memories. But when my mother passed away 3 years ago, he just stopped. He closed the shop. He started wandering, looking for things that weren't there anymore. Elias looked out the window. He thought about the way Arthur had looked at his own dusty tools. He wasn't just wandering last night, Silas. He was looking for someone. They arrived at a part of the city Elias had never visited. The streets were lined with old brick warehouses that had been turned into studios. Silas pulled up in front of a massive wooden door with a tarnished brass sign that read, "The Woodworker's Heart." This was his kingdom, Silas said, his voice thick with emotion. He hasn't let anyone inside for 2 years. Not even me. He says the air in there is waiting for the right person to breathe it. Silas used a heavy iron key to open the door. The moment they stepped inside, the world changed. The smell hit Elias' first hit was a thick, intoxicating mix of sawdust, beeswax, linseed oil, and ancient wood. It didn't smell like a workplace. It smelled like a library of trees. Dust motes danced in the shafts of morning light hitting the floor. Everywhere Elias looked, there were projects frozen in time. A half-finished rocking chair sat in the corner. A massive oak dining table was draped in a cloth. But what caught Elias's eye were the walls. They were covered in sketches, just like the ones in the notebook. Thousands of them. Where is he? Elias asked, his heart hammering. He's at the hospital now, Silas said, checking a text on his phone. The police found him at the old clockmaker's shop door where it used to be. He was just standing there waiting. He's physically okay, just cold and tired. But he told the doctors he couldn't stay. He kept saying he had delivered the message and had to go back to work. Silas turned to Elias, looking at him with a mix of curiosity and skepticism. I've spent my life trying to learn what he knows. I went to business school so I could run this place. I bought the best modern tools. But he never let me in. He said I had the math but not the soul. Then he disappears in a snowstorm, spends the night with a stranger, and leaves his notebook behind. Silas walked over to a large desk and turned on a lamp. Do you know what's in that notebook, Elias? It's not just designs. It's the list of his clients. These aren't just people with money. These are people who owe their family's history to my father's hands. If he gave you that book, he didn't just give you a diary. He gave you his legacy. Elias felt a wave of dizziness. He thought about the orange sticker on his door. He thought about the tomato soup and the mismatched mugs. I'm just a guy who couldn't pay his rent, Silas. I'm not a master. I was just there. My father doesn't believe in just being there, Silas replied. He pointed to a piece of wood on the workbench. Try it. What? The planer. That piece of walnut. Try it. I want to see what he saw. Elias hesitated. His hands were shaking. He stepped up to the heavy workbench. It felt solid, like it was rooted into the earth. He picked up the hand planer. It was perfectly balanced, the metal cool against his palm. He positioned it on the dark wood and pushed. The sound was like a long, satisfied breath. A thin, curling ribbon of wood peeled away, revealing a grain so beautiful it looked like flowing water. Elias felt a spark in his chest, a feeling he hadn't felt in years. It was the feeling of being good at something. It was the feeling of being useful. He saw your hands, Silas whispered, watching the wood. He told the doctors that he found a man who treated a stranger like a guest and a broken chair like a tragedy. He said, "The boy has the touch, Silas. He just needs a reason to use it. Just then, the phone in the shop began to ring. It was an old-fashioned bell that echoed through the high ceilings. Silas answered it. His face went pale, then he slowly began to smile. He handed the phone to Elias. "It's for you," Silas said. "It's the hospital." Elias took the phone, his hand trembling. "Hello? Elias?" The voice was faint, but unmistakable. It was Arthur. He sounded like a man who had finally finished a very long walk. "The soup was a bit salty, Elias, but the company was exactly what I needed." "Arthur, are you okay? Why did you leave?" "I had to leave so you could find the way," the old man said, his voice sparking with a bit of the old mischief. "In the back of the notebook, under the last sketch, there is a key taped to the page. That key opens the small cabinet under the window. Inside, you will find a contract. It's not for a job, Elias. It's for a partnership." Elias fumbled with the notebook, flipping to the very back. His fingers found a small piece of tape and a silver key. "I don't understand," Elias said, tears finally stinging his eyes. "Why me? You don't even know me." "I know you better than you know yourself," Arthur replied. "You gave a man a seat at your table when you were about to lose the table itself. That is the kind of man who deserves to build things that last. Now, put the phone down. There is a man named Mr. Henderson who has been waiting 10 years for someone to fix his grandfather's desk. His number is the second one on the list. Call him. Tell him the heart is open again." Elias hung up the phone. He looked at Silas, who was watching him with a new kind of respect. Elias looked at the key in his hand. The weight of the world hadn't disappeared, but for the first time, he felt strong enough to carry it. He didn't know how he was going to pay the back rent yet, or how he would explain this to the landlord. But as he looked at the walnut wood on the bench, he realized that the orange sticker on his door wasn't an ending. It was a sign that he was being pushed out of a small life so he could step into a big one. The lost old man had never been lost at all. He had been a guide, leading Elias through the storm, to the one place he was always meant to be. The transition from a man who owned nothing to a man who held the keys to a legendary workshop happened. So fast that Elias felt like he was walking in a dream. But the dream felt very heavy. Standing in the middle of Arthur's workshop the day after Christmas, Elias looked at the tools. Each one looked like it had its own soul, polished by decades of use. He felt like an imposter. He kept waiting for someone to walk in, point a finger at him, and tell him to go back to his empty apartment and his orange eviction notice. But nobody came to kick him out. Instead, the phone rang. It was the second number in Arthur's book, Mr. Henderson. Elias's hands shook as he picked up the receiver. On the other end was an elderly voice, sharp and impatient but layered with a deep, hidden sadness. Mr. Henderson didn't want to talk about the weather or the holidays. He wanted to know if the heart was really open. He had a desk massive, cherrywood writing, guessed that had been in his family since the late 1800s. It had been damaged in a move years ago, and he had refused to let anyone touch it until Arthur came back. "Arthur didn't come back," Elias said, his voice barely a whisper, "but he sent me." 2 hours later, a moving truck arrived. Silas, Arthur's son, helped the movers bring the desk inside. When the blankets were pulled off, Elias gasped. It was a disaster. The wood was scarred, the legs were wobbly, and a large section of the intricate trim had been snapped off and lost. To anyone else, it looked like firewood. To a craftsman, it looked like a mountain that had to be climbed. "My father wouldn't have taken this job if he didn't think it could be saved," Silas said. Looking at Elias, he stayed for a moment, resting a hand on Elias's shoulder. "The landlord of your apartment called me. I took care of the back rent. You don't owe them anything anymore. Your things are being moved into the small apartment upstairs. You have a roof, Elias. Now, give this desk a soul again." Silas left, and the silence of the workshop settled in. Elias stood alone with the broken desk. The pressure was suffocating. If he failed this, he wasn't just failing himself. He was failing Arthur's reputation. He opened the leather notebook and turned to the page where Arthur had sketched the desk years ago. There were notes in the margins. "Cherrywood is stubborn. It hides its beauty behind a hard shell. You have to be patient. You have to listen to the grain. Elias began to work. The first few hours were terrifying. Every time he picked up a chisel, his mind screamed at him that he was going to ruin it. He worked through the night, the heater humming in the corner. He cleaned the wood, stripping away years of bad varnish and dirt. He found that when he focused on the wood, the voices of doubt in his head grew quiet. He remembered the old man's blue eyes and the way he had looked at Elias's hands. Around 3 a.m., Elias hit a wall. He was trying to recreate a missing piece of the trim, but the wood kept splintering. He tried 3 times, and 3 times it snapped. He sat on the floor, his head in his hands, feeling the old, familiar sting of failure. I can't do this, he thought. I'm just a guy who fixes broken chairs. This is history. I'm going to ruin it. He reached for the notebook, looking for an answer. As he flipped the pages, a small, loose scrap of paper fell out. It wasn't a drawing. It was a receipt from a grocery store from the day they met. On the back, in Arthur's shaky but elegant handwriting, was a note. Elias, the wood only breaks when you try to force it to be something it isn't. Stop trying to be me. Be the man who shared his soup. Elias stared at the note. He realized he had been trying to copy Arthur's style perfectly, holding his breath, moving with tension. He stood up, took a deep breath, and loosened his grip on the tools. He stopped thinking about the master and started thinking about the desk. He thought about Mr. Henderson, an old man who just wanted to sit at his father's desk one more time. He worked with a new rhythm. He stopped fighting the cherry wood and started working with it. By dawn, the missing trim was shaped. It wasn't a perfect copy of Arthur's work. It had a slightly different curve, a bit more of Elias's own touch, but it was beautiful. It fit perfectly. As the sun began to rise on the 3rd day, the desk was finished. It glowed with a deep, rich red hue. The scars were gone, but the character of the wood remained. Elias was exhausted, his clothes covered in sawdust, his eyes burning. He heard a knock at the door. It was Mr. Henderson. The old man walked in slowly, leaning on a cane. He didn't say hello. He walked straight to the desk. He ran his withered hand over the smooth surface, his fingers stopping at the trim Elias had carved. He stayed silent for a long time. Elias held his breath, expecting a complaint, expecting to be told it wasn't good enough. Then, he saw a tear roll down the old man's cheek. I haven't seen it like this since I was 10 years old, Mr. Henderson whispered. My father used to sit here and write letters to my mother during the war. I thought the memories were gone when the wood broke. But you brought them back? Mr. Henderson turned to Elias and did something unexpected. He reached out and shook Elias's hand. Arthur told me he found a diamond in the rough. He was right. You have a gift, young man. Don't ever let the world tell you otherwise. Mr. Henderson left a check on the workbench. When Elias looked at it later, it was for more money than he had earned in the last 2 years combined. It was enough to buy supplies, to stock the kitchen, and to truly start a life. But the biggest surprise came that afternoon. Silas arrived with a small box. My father saw the photos I sent him of the desk, Silas said. He's still in the hospital for observation, but he's doing well. He told me to give you this. Elias opened the box. Inside was a set of heavy antique brass branding irons. They were used to mark finished furniture. One had Arthur's initials. The other was brand new. It was a simple, elegant design of a small flame inside a heart with the letter E at the center. He wants you to sign your work from now on, Silas said. You aren't just an assistant, Elias. You're the successor. Elias looked at the brand, then at the workshop that was now his home. He realized that the man he had saved on Christmas Eve hadn't just given him a job. He had given him an identity. He had taken a man who was invisible to the world and made him a creator. But as Elias felt the first real sense of peace he had known in years, he noticed something in the back of the workshop. A man was standing by the door, watching him. He was younger, wearing a tattered coat, looking exactly like Elias had looked just a few days ago. Lost, cold, and desperate. The story was coming full circle, and Elias knew exactly what he had to do next. The young man standing by the workshop door looked like a ghost. He was shivering, his shoulders hunched up to his ears. and he was staring at the warm glow of the shop with a mix of hunger and shame. Elias looked at him and didn't see a stranger. He saw a mirror. He saw himself standing on that street corner just a week ago, waiting for the world to finally swallow him whole. Elias didn't hesitate. He didn't ask what the man wanted, or if he was dangerous. He simply walked over, opened the heavy wooden door wide, and gestured toward the heater. "It's colder out there than it looks," Elias said, his voice soft. "I just put some coffee on. Come in and get your blood moving." The young man, whose name was Leo, stepped inside tentatively. He looked at the beautiful cherry wood desk that was ready to be delivered, and he looked at the tools. He looked like he expected to be yelled at, but Elias just handed him a mug, the same mismatched mug he had used to serve Arthur's soup for the next hour. Elias didn't preach. He didn't tell Leo how to live. He just worked. He let Leo sit in the warmth, watching as Elias prepared a new slab of oak for a project. He realized that this was the secret Arthur had known. Sometimes people don't need a lecture. They just need to be in a room where something is being built instead of something being broken. "I used to do a bit of this," Leo whispered, watching Elias use the plane. "In school, my grandfather showed me how to sand things down. I liked the smell of it." Elias handed him a piece of sandpaper. "The grain on this corner is a bit rough. If you've got the time, you could help me out." As Leo began to work, his movements awkward but earnest, Elias felt a profound sense of clarity. His debt to Arthur wasn't a financial one. It was a debt of grace. He realized that the only way to truly keep what he had been given was to give it away to the next person who walked through the door. A few days later, Silas called. Arthur was being released from the hospital. He wasn't going back to his lonely apartment. He was moving in with Silas's family. But before he went home, he had one request. He wanted to see the heart one last time. When the car pulled up, Elias felt a nervous flutter in his stomach. He had cleaned the shop until it shone. The cherrywood desk had been delivered, and in its place was a new project, a sturdy, simple dining table Elias was building for a local shelter. Arthur walked in slowly, leaning on a walker this time, but his blue eyes were as sharp as ever. He took a long, deep breath of the sawdust-heavy air and closed his eyes. A small, peaceful smile touched his lips. "It smells like life in here again," Arthur whispered. He toured the shop, his fingers trailing over the workbenches. When he reached the spot where Leo was busy organizing the scrap wood in the back, Arthur stopped. He looked at Leo, then at Elias. He didn't say anything, but the look of pride in his eyes was enough to make Elias's throat tighten. He knew that Arthur saw what was happening. The cycle of kindness was continuing. Elias led Arthur to the small velvet chair, the one he had moved from his old apartment into the shop. Arthur sat down with a sigh of relief. "You found the key, I see," Arthur said, nodding toward the branding iron on the bench.
"I did,"
Elias replied, "but I haven't used the one with your name on it. I don't feel like I've earned that yet." Arthur reached out and grabbed Elias's forearm with surprising strength. "Elias, listen to me. I didn't give you this shop because you were the best woodworker in the city. I gave it to you because you were the only man in that city who saw me. Everyone else saw a lost old man. They saw a problem to be moved along. You saw a guest. You saw a human being." Arthur looked around the room one last time. "The wood is just a medium, Elias. The real work is how we treat the people who sit in the chairs we build. You've already mastered the hardest part of the craft." They sat in silence for a while, watching the winter sun begin to set. It was a different kind of sunset than the one on Christmas Eve. That one had felt like an ending. But this one felt like a quiet promise. Before Arthur left, he handed Elias one final gift. It was a small, hand-carved wooden bird, no bigger than a coin. It was perfectly smooth, shaped with a level of detail that seemed impossible. "Keep this in your pocket," Arthur said. "Whenever you feel like the orange sticker is coming back, whenever you feel like you aren't enough, just touch this. Remember that a piece of scrap wood can become a bird, and a man with nothing can become a master. All it takes is a little bit of sanding and a lot of patience." As Silas helped Arthur back to the car, Elias stood in the doorway. He watched them drive away until the taillights disappeared into the city traffic. He looked back at his shop. He looked at Leo, who was still working, his face focused and calm. Elias went to his workbench and picked up the branding iron, the one with his own initial inside the heart. He heated it up until it glowed a dull, honest red. He pressed it into the underside of the table. He was building for the shelter. The scent of burning wood filled the air, a scent of permanence, of a name being written into history. Elias wasn't the man drowning in debt anymore. He wasn't the man waiting for the world to end. He was a builder. He was a protector of memories. And as he looked out the window at the falling snow, he finally understood that the greatest thing Arthur had taught him wasn't how to fix wood. It was how to fix a life. He walked over to Leo and placed a hand on the young man's shoulder. "Hungry?" Elias asked. "I think it's about time we had some soup." The story of the lost old man had ended, but the story of the workshop had just begun. And in that small, warm corner of a cold world, the light stayed on long into the night, a beacon for anyone else who might be looking for their way home. 5 years had passed since the night the snow nearly swallowed Elias whole. The city had changed, as cities always do. New buildings had gone up. Old shops had closed. And the park bench where Elias first found Arthur had been replaced by a modern metal one. But inside the brick walls of the workshop, time seemed to move at a different pace. The smell of cedar and beeswax was still the same, though it was now joined by the scent of fresh coffee and the steady, rhythmic sound of 3 people working in harmony. Elias was no longer the thin, a trembling man with an eviction notice in his pocket. His shoulders had broadened from years of lifting heavy oak. His hands were mapped with the small, honorable scars of a craftsman. He stood at the center of the shop, watching Leo finish the legs of a vanity. Leo wasn't a guest anymore. He was a partner. He had stayed, learned, and grown, proving that Arthur's philosophy of looking at the hands was a universal truth. It was another Christmas Eve. But the atmosphere was entirely different. The shop was closed to the public, but the lights were bright. They were preparing for their annual tradition. In the center of the room stood a massive, beautifully crafted dining table. It wasn't for a client. Every year, Elias and Leo built one community table to be donated to a family or a center in need. A car pulled up outside, and Elias felt that familiar stir in his chest. Silas stepped out, carrying a large box of food. He looked older, his hair graying at the temples, but he walked with a lightness he hadn't possessed years ago. Behind him, moving slowly, but with a stubborn pride, was Arthur. Arthur was nearly 90 now. He used a wheelchair most of the time, but today he insisted on walking into the shop with his cane. As he crossed the threshold, he stopped and closed his eyes, inhaling deeply. "Still the best smell in the world," Arthur whispered. They gathered around the stove. Not for soup this time, but for a full holiday meal. As they sat together, the conversation wasn't about the furniture they had sold or the money they had made. They talked about the people. They talked about Mr. Henderson, who had passed away peacefully at his father's desk. They talked about the young mother who had received last year's table and how it had turned her tiny apartment into a home. "No," Silas said. Looking at Elias, "There are people in the city calling this place the miracle shop. They say, if you're truly lost, you eventually find your way to this door." Elias looked at the old leather notebook, which now sat in a glass display case on the wall, preserved like a holy relic. "I didn't do anything special, Silas. I just opened the door. Arthur was the one who showed me how to keep it open." Arthur reached out and touched the edge of the table. His fingers, though trembling with age, still moved with the grace of a man who understood the soul of wood. "No, Elias. I gave you a map, but you're the one who walked the path. I spent 50 years wondering if my work would die with me. Because of one bowl of salty soup, I get to sit here and see that the heart is still beating." As the night went on, a heavy snow began to fall outside, mirroring the night they first met. Elias looked out the window and saw a figure huddled under the street lamp across the road. Without a word, he stood up and grabbed a heavy wool coat from the raquan of several he kept specifically for this purpose. "Where are you going?" Leo asked, though he already knew the answer. "He's going to see if someone needs a place to sit for a while. Elias said with a smile. He stepped out into the cold. The wind bit at his face, but he didn't feel the old dread. He felt a deep, unshakable warmth. He walked toward the figure in the snow, the heavy coat draped over his arm. He didn't see a stranger. He saw a beginning. He saw another story waiting to be written as Elias approached the person. He realized that this was the true legacy of Christmas Eve. It wasn't about the money, the workshop, or the fame. It was about the simple, human realization that we are all just walking each other home. Back inside the shop, Arthur watched through the glass. He saw Elias put the coat around the stranger's shoulders. He saw them turn together and walk toward the warm golden light of the workshop. Arthur picked up his glass of water and raised it slightly, a silent toast to the man who had sheltered a lost old man and, in doing so, found himself. The workshop door opened, letting in a swirl of snow and a burst of cold air, followed by the sound of Elias's voice, welcoming a new guest into the warmth. The circle remained unbroken. The light stayed on. And in the heart of the city, the true, real-life story of kindness continued. One person, one bowl of soup, and one piece of wood at a time.